welcome to FA Exclusive. I'm Atul Singh. With me is Glenn Carl. As usual, we are going to look at the three most important issues of the month. This May, we have three extremely interesting issues for you. Number one, of course, is Taiwan-China tensions increase as the new Taiwanese president takes charge. Number two, the Iranian president falls out of the sky. And number three, Rishi Sunak takes post-Brexit UK to the polls. So let's begin with Taiwan-China tensions increasing as the new Taiwanese president takes charge. Glenn, what is the backstory here?
Right. Well, hello, Tool, and everyone else. Well, let's start at the cradle of civilization and then skipping Egypt, I suppose, and then move progressively west to Iran and then the UK. And we can't help but touch upon the US, the leading civilization for the moment. So what's the backstory in Taiwan?
Is America civilization or simply a superpower?
Yes, well, I've been told many a time America has no culture, but that's the envy
That's the misfortune
of the
spending
former
time in France.
The envy of the formerly great. So what's happening in Taiwan, and why do we care? And probably all of you will know the few little facts I'll set out to set the table, but. So Taiwan is officially the Republic of China and came to be at the conclusion of the Chinese Civil War between the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao, and the nationalists' defeat. They fled to Taiwan and became the Republic, which continues to claim that it represents China, although that's really words at this point, which no one expects to occur. It's been governed independently, though, for now 76 years. Is that right? 75 years.
Yeah. Let's say 49 is when Chiang Kai-shek flees.
Right,
so
1949.
to 2024, so right. 75, yeah?
75 years.
Yeah,
so, of course, Beijing has always maintained, and the Taiwanese, the nationalists, agree that there is only one China. That's a very important concept, which I'm sure you all know about. But there are two ways of governing the single state. And the PRC considers Taiwan a renegade and has always claimed that it will unify China once and for all. That's relevant. It's not just history now. It's relevant for two reasons. The first, I would argue, is that Xi Jinping became the leader of China in 2012, and since then has increased steadily the pressure on Taiwan and the claims of Beijing for Taiwan through a series of diplomatic and military steps around the island and concerning the island. Now, Taiwan itself, and this gets us to what Atul explained, has recently had an election in January in which the victor has taken a nuanced position, but one that angers Beijing even more than up to now, because Beijing feels, and the elected leader of Taiwan indicates, has taken steps to subtly move Taiwan towards independence while repudiating that he will claim it. So that's really the geostrategic issue, and it is maybe the most important one on Earth right now. And Atul, tell us what's going on.
So before I jump into the details of the Taiwanese elections, Taiwan had elections in January. There's something more I should just dwell upon. And that is the 1992 consensus, Glenn. That is the year when the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, and the Kuomintang, the KMT, which was Chiang Kai-shek's party, the party that ruled Taiwan for many years. And remember, Taiwan initially was an authoritarian one-party state. And so these two parties got together and came to a consensus. And that consensus was, well, the two sides of the strait belong to one China, and they would work together to seek national reunification. Now, for the KMT, this means one China, different interpretations. For the CCP, it means one China, which has exacerbated under Emperor Xi Jinping. But the important thing is that Taiwan's KMT drafted constitution continues to recognize China, Mongolia, Taiwan, Tibet, and the South China Sea as part of the ROC. So the KMT has never supported independence for Taiwan and argues for closer cross-strait ties with China. Perhaps the KMT still, I doubt it very much, but perhaps they still have fascination or fantasies of China one day turning a democracy and KMT winning power in China and redressing a historic wrong. Who knows? But the point is that the KMT and the CCP do not differ that much on their interpretations of China.
It almost sounds like a crazy lunatic assertion or thought, but I'm jumping in just to say that I have been, and I guess all of us are, repeatedly stunned at the sincerity of convictions of other parties holding beliefs that I consider and many consider to be delusional, and yet
the biggest delusion is that if you blow yourself up as a jihadi, you get 72 virgins in heaven. Think about that, Glenn.
Until the issue is utterly resolved, and that's not in the cards immediately, barring what Atul will talk about, and I'll comment on. We have to continue to take it seriously and into account. Sorry.
No worries. Excellent point. So the important thing is that everything was going hunky-dory, and not quite, but none of these tensions were that acute until the rise of a new party, which is not so new anymore, which is the Democratic Progressive Party, which is currently in power, which has been in power for a while. And the Democratic Progressive Party really wants independence. And the previous president, and I'll go into her in greater detail later, when she was elected president in 2016, she promised to abide by Taiwan's constitution, and that constitution, as we've just discussed, is a one China document. So on the whole, basically, it was a policy of dialogue instead of confrontation, and tensions were largely managed. Now, what has happened is that on January 13, 2024, Taiwan held elections for its presidency and 113-seat legislature, which is called the Legislative Yuan. Vice President Lai Ching-te, also known as William Lai, and he belongs to the Democratic Progressive Party, which I've just described, the DPP. He won the presidential elections with 40% of the vote. He's a physician, generally regarded as a competent chap, but generally also regarded as more pro-independence than his predecessor. The Kuomintang candidate, the KMT candidate, was runner-up. His name is Hu Yu-yi. He was runner-up with 33.5% of the vote. And the Taiwan People's Party, which is a new party. So it's not just the DPP, which is the new, which has come through. Now the DPP is relatively old. There is this new party, and it won 26.5% of the vote. It came third. And part of the reason this party is on the rise is because there are no jobs in Taiwan. This is a populist party. We can go into more about the domestic politics another time. But really, Taiwan is now politically, it's gone from a one-party state to this tiny island of 23 million people, now has three parties. And all three of them have different visions for the country. So our friend Tai Sing-wen whom I've mentioned before, she won both her presidential elections in 2016 and 2020 with over 56% of the vote. Clearly, President Lai is weaker than his predecessor. DPP, the president's party, and this is something all of you must note, the DPP has lost control of the Legislative Yuan. It has won 51 seats. The KMT has won
of the parliament.
52.
That's what the
Pardon me?
Of the parliament. I was just putting it into.
Yes, of the parliament. The Legislative Yuan is the national parliament. That's the name for it. Thank you. Thank you, Glenn. And the TPP has won 8. So the KMT has 42. The TPP has 8. And now basically you have a split parliament, a split power structure, almost like France back in the day of cohabitation, wherein you'd have one party holding the presidency and the other the parliament. And that is what you get in Taiwan. And now, of course, Lai and the DPP will find it hard to push through the government's legislative agenda. And there are real differences, not just on domestic policy, but on foreign policy, and most importantly, on China. So now we get Lai, who's a self-proclaimed pragmatic worker for Taiwanese independence. Yeah. And whilst he has promised continuity with Tsai Ing-wen on cross-strait relations, he has signaled a more defiant stance. He spoke in stronger terms on May 20th, which is when his presidency was inaugurated, which is a few days ago, about Taiwanese sovereignty, and subtly shifted from some of the more ambiguous formulations favored by Tsai. Now, obviously, Beijing, especially under Xi Jinping, is nationalistic. It saw Lai's speech as a provocation. 3 days later, they launched, or the Chinese military launched, exercises around Taiwan.
Let me just put the Beijing's peak into a little context. And this has always been the case since 1949, that China is sensitive about anything a Taiwanese politician or figure or anywhere in the world that does or says about Taiwan's relationship with the mainland China. But just one example, I think most of you will know or will recall. Even a student, an undergraduate student in Australia, who said something that irritated or differed from the official line coming out of Beijing with respect to Taiwan, was punished. The Beijing government essentially went after this person, pressuring the Australian government and the university, and threatening the individual. And that's simply a student expressing a thought, a passing thought, even. So when a student in a university in Australia is pursued ruthlessly, when a politician in Taiwan says something, Beijing makes it, no matter what the statement, a big issue.
Yeah, exactly. And so the Chinese military says there's a strong punishment for the self-ruled islands separatist acts. But even without Lai's provocation, Beijing might have launched military exercises nonetheless, just to threaten the new chap. And note, the exercises took place all around the main island, and for the first time, they targeted the Taipei-controlled islands of Kinmen, Matsu, Wuxi, Dongyin, which lie close to the Chinese coast. Remember, Taiwan is far away from the coast, but there are certain islands that are really close. And should
they're within loudspeaker distance from the mainland.
Yes. So should the Chinese
each the nationalists and the communists respectively have erected for decades massive towers and loudspeakers and amuse themselves by broadcasting propaganda to each other about how in Taiwan you can buy any toothpaste you want. They used to say. And the Chinese communists would denounce the nationalists as yellow running dogs of imperialism and colonialism, and they were about to be freed and so on. But
Very charming indeed. It must be great fun to live there, I suppose, with all the noise pollution, non-stop noise pollution. Anyway, should China's People's Liberation Army want to take over some of these closed islands, that is a pretty easy exercise for them. So this they've ratcheted up the threat. And the reality is the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, distrusts Lai. It's sending Lai a clear signal. Tensions between Taiwan and China, however, are unlikely to escalate further. In contrast, tensions within Taiwan are running high. I don't know how many have followed the fact that the KMT and the TPP, the two opposition parties, have passed a controversial reform bill after days of hostile debate and physical fights between MPs inside and mass protests by citizens outside. This gives the Legislative Yuan, Taiwan's national parliament, increased power to call on and question officials, military figures, and citizens, as well as demand documents. The DPP sees these reforms as undermining Lai's presidency even before it has begun. So forget Taiwan-China, things are really fraught within Taiwan right now.
So, thanks, Atul. I think I have a slightly different coloration. I'm not good enough in colors to illustrate it with two different tones, shades of color, pink or magenta or something. However, to illustrate how the tensions have grown, as you said, or changed, and we are in I fear many of us do, a fundamentally different and more dangerous phase or era. You alluded to or mentioned, among other islands, Quemoy and Matsu. They're called something slightly different now. It doesn't really matter. In 1958, the big crisis between the United States and China was over Quemoy and Matsu. And these are two islands that are within loudspeaker range of the mainland. Mao at that time became irritated at statements that the Taiwanese and the Americans were making, and the tensions continued high. And so they shelled, and this has gone on for decades, they shelled those two islands, which are controlled and occupied. They're residents of the nationalist China on these two islands, which are only 2 miles away from the coast, or something to that effect. However, and then the United States responded by sending aircraft carriers, and everyone feared that there was a great war. We only learned decades later, I think 50 years later, that Mao and then Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, who was an ardent, really polarizing Cold Warrior, anti-communist.
I thought he was a lovey-dovey, cuddly chap.
They had communicated through back channels with each other. And the Chinese made clear that they were not going to invade Quemoy and Matsu, and that they would shell areas at a certain time and place. And John Foster Dulles made clear that the United States had no intention of taking any steps militarily against China. And so that allowed the Americans to beat their breasts about how strong they were in defending Taiwan's independence, and China to beat its breasts in asserting its aggrieved sovereignty and claim over the islands in a way that didn't really kill anybody or lead to a clash between the two countries. Now, that was 1958, when the Cold War was at its most intense, theoretically. Now, the equation has changed, because China is much more powerful than it was, and it can take steps that it could not then at a lower cost. Now the cost would be lower initially because the capability is higher. And you have increasing infringements literally on on Taiwan's territorial waters, both recognized and those and economic exclusive zones. And there's a slow, progressive erosion or challenge, increasing challenge, is certainly accurate to state, of Taiwan's sovereignty, which raises the question about when does one respond to increasing incursions? Because then that party that responds becomes responsible for a military clash. That's a fundamentally different equation that we're living now because of what's happened in Beijing in the last 12 years, 14 years, and what Atul just talked about, given the change of the political life in Taiwan.
Glenn, you mentioned last time in a podcast we did on Japan that Japan now sees Taiwan's security as paramount to its own national security. And so the Chinese actions will have ramifications far beyond just Taiwan and China. Japan, South Korea, and others may very well find the Taiwan situation of interest, if not of national interest.
Well, it is a world-shaking importance and danger.
And especially given Taiwan's importance to the global economy, it is this place where all the high-end, or much of the high-end semiconductors are made. Should there be a war, perhaps the Zoom call we are having might not be able to take place. Many of your phones may not function. So many of your refrigerators might suddenly become more expensive or less primitive. So there are lots of consequences to a potential conflict. But we'll move on from Taiwan now to something else.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.